Welcome everybody to the third event of the year in Emerson College's reading series, sponsored by the Department of Writing, Literature, and Publishing. I'm Julia Glass, director of the series, and I'm extremely pleased that today we are able to host a writer who was originally scheduled to join us in person almost exactly a year ago. And we all know what happened then. While we are sorry not to be able to greet Linda Hogan on our Boston campus, we're grateful to the technology that enables us to have her appear with us from her remote cabin in snowbound Colorado, and to the weather gods for sparing her a loss of power. Thank you also to Angela Sue, Aggie Milholland, and Elbert Lee for handling all Zoom logistics. And finally, to my colleague, Christine Casson, who will introduce Linda and moderate this Q&A. She will also take a few audience questions at the end. Christine Casson is the author of After the First World, a book of poems. Her work has appeared in numerous journals, including in England, Agenda and Stand, as well as the Dalhousie Review, Double Take, Natural Bridge, Alabama Literary Review, and in the anthologies Fashioned Pleasures, Never Before, and Conversation Pieces. She has also published critical essays on the work of Leslie Marmon Silko and the poetry of Linda Hogan and Robert Penn Warren. Ms. Casson is currently writing a book of nonfiction that explores the relationship between trauma and memory, and is at work on a study of the poetic sequence entitled Sequence and Time Signature, a study in poetic orchestration. Her second book of poems is forthcoming from Salmon Poetry in 2021. Here at Emerson, she is a scholar writer in residence. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you everyone who's put this together, and thank you, Linda, so much for coming. It's really wonderful. I've been waiting for this for a year now, so I'm really happy it's happening. So I want to introduce Linda Hogan to all of you first before we start the Q&A. Linda Hogan is the author of 9 books of poems, most recently A History of Kindness in 2020, just came out last fall. Before that, Dark Sweet, New and Selected Poems from Coffee House Press in 2014. Indios, a long poem and also a one-woman performance piece in 2012, and Rounding the Human Corners, also from Coffee House Press in 2008, and a nominee for the Pulitzer Prize. She has also written 4 novels, Mean Spirit, winner of the Oklahoma Book Award, the Mountains and Plains Book Award, and also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Solar Storms, a finalist for the International Impact Award and a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. Power, also a finalist for the International Impact Award in Ireland, and most recently, People of the Whale. Linda's nonfiction includes her most recent book, The Radiant Lives of Animals, just published in 2020, a collection of essays titled Dwellings, A Spiritual History of the Living World, and also The Woman Who Watches Over the World, a native memoir. She has also written with Brenda Peterson, Sightings, The Mysterious Journey of the Gray Whale for National Geographic Books, and edited several anthologies on nature and spirituality. She also wrote the script, Everything Has a Spirit, a PBS documentary on American Indian religious freedom. She's also been the recipient of numerous awards, to name just some, of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, the Colorado Book Award, the American Book Award, a Lannan Fellowship, and has received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Native Writers Circle of the Americas. Most recently in 2016, she was awarded the Thoreau Prize from PEN America. She's a member of the Chickasaw Nation and has taught at Indian Arts Institute, and is writer in residence for the Chickasaw Nation, and also professor emerita at the University of Colorado. It is difficult to speak in an introduction about the scope and depth of Linda Hogan's writing and work over these many years of her career. So I will speak to just a few that are part of her 2 most recent books, A History of Kindness, her book of poems, and The Radiant Lives of Animals. Both address environmental and indigenous activism on behalf of nature and our planet, and also convey the complexity and profundity of Native history, knowledge, and spirituality. But these books also address what it means to be human at our best. Linda seeks in us as readers that part of ourselves or our souls that comprehends the greatness and significance of what we may sometimes and wrongly see as other, the entire non-human living world, animals, birds, insects, plants, and directs us, and this is her word, to behold it with all that word implies as non-okcha, Chickasaw for all alive and all sacred. She reminds us that we are a part of this living world larger and fuller than ourselves, and that we must remember, recreate, and sustain our relationship with it and with one another. She writes that our need for this connection, in fact, what I like to think of as a kinship, quote, is like the shadow attached to our feet, never to be walked away from. And she says, quote, we do not live alone in the skin of any environment. We are part of a collective. But she writes, it is often easier to ignore the dialogue asked of us by the earth, its language spoken within and without our skin. Linda Hogan, throughout her many years as writer, thinker, teacher, and environmentalist, repeatedly reminds us of and returns us to the awe and wonder of that dialogue, and asks that we listen and act carefully so that when we, as mere humans, do take part in the world collective, as she says in her poem, Watching Over, we make sure it is in the right way. Please join me in welcoming Linda Hogan.
Thank you.
So I'm going to be asking you some questions tonight, this afternoon, Linda. I'm rushing the day along a little, aren't I? And some of them are going to address some of the subject of your work, and some of them will also address what it means to be a writer and a Native writer. So my first question for you this evening is about the scope of your work. Your first publication, a book of poems titled Calling Myself Home, was published in 1978. 42 years later, this past fall of 2020, you published a book of poems, A History of Kindness, and a nonfiction book, The Radiant Lives of Animals. In between, you have published an additional 7 books of poems, 4 books of nonfiction, and 4 novels, and also edited at least 2 or 3 anthologies. So the question I have for you this afternoon is, how do you think your work has changed over the course of your writing career? Or how has your vision of your work changed over the course of your writing career?
I think that the first book, like so many first books, is autobiographical. It's set in a certain place where my family was, and that it was just made up of the stories of the world around us when we were young. And I think now I've had time to grow and mature, to read a lot of other writing. You know, when I wrote that first book, I didn't know what I was getting in for. I had no idea what I was going to be doing. I didn't know this was going to be my life and career and what I would be doing for the next 40 years. But, you know, I still love it. The minute I discovered poetry, I fell in love with it, and I still feel that way. Only now I can approach it from the viewpoint of an elder, of an older person, and a person who's had time to grow more intelligent and learn more and study more. I'm constantly doing research in almost any field. And, you know, that shows in my work.
Thanks, Linda. I think that's really interesting to think about how initially a lot of writers come out of a sort of an autobiography. I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to the way, I mean, you use the words elder, and I really like that particular word. And I wonder if you could speak to maybe just a little bit more about how one might see the world differently if one has been sort of looking at the world for a long time. I don't know if you have might want to add to that. In other words, as someone looking at the world as an elder, for some young writers, how might you explain that sort of vision?
I think that you look at it from your own perspective when you're younger, from inside you. And then when you get a little bit older, you think about other people more. And then as you get even older, you think about the whole world outside of you. And so your perspective keeps changing.
Thank you. I also thought, since you mentioned, I was going to ask you this question later, but since you mentioned it, might you speak briefly to this idea of research, and how that makes its way into your work? Maybe you can give us, the audience, some example of how that works and how that's happened with you.
Well, in Radiant Lives of Animals, for instance, I had no idea that the butterflies came from under the ground with the ants. And so that was really a surprise for me. And when I was reading about the ants back before E.O. Wilson, the research that I did on ants, I was just so interested in their lives, and especially after I started handing them building materials and they accepted them. And so then I started doing the research and I read all the different stories about them. And the one that interested me most was the one where the blue butterflies come out from where the ants have nourished them, taken care of them throughout the winter. It's a reciprocal relationship. They get a sweetness from the butterfly pupa. And then they take care of them and then they release them when they grow wings. And so that was research. And, right now I'm working on a novel and I'm reading about not just boarding schools, but all the different kinds of institutions that housed Indian children and adults during the early 1900s.
Great, thank you. I think that kind of, some of what you're talking about leads into another question I had. Oftentimes in non-native culture, you mentioned E.O. Wilson, for example, oftentimes in non-native Western culture, we look to research and science for viable knowledge of the natural world. So can you speak to how Indigenous knowledge also provides a wellspring about this same natural world and to how this knowledge is transmitted through tribal culture? And then maybe as a follow-up to that, maybe a little maybe discussion about the role of storytelling and what role that plays in the human relationships in the landscape.
Well, for one thing, Indigenous knowledge and science is much older than Western science. It's been around for millennia, and people have been observing and understanding and knowing how to live with the forests and the rivers and how to take care of all of that. And Western science is only now starting to acknowledge some of the things that they've been told by Native peoples and then thought was just anecdotal knowledge. So there's a lot of intelligence for people who've observed for centuries that gets passed on. It gets passed on in the family stories. It gets my cat just really wants in this. It gets passed on in family stories. It gets passed on in ceremonies, particularly Navajo ceremonies, because they're maybe among the most complex. And they contain not just, say, a single plant, but everything that has a relationship with a single plant, every insect that comes to it, everything that lives around it, and the pollen of it, where it goes, what it does. So those kinds of things, the relationships have been pretty much ignored by Western science. They find something and they take it into the lab and study it. And so all of the research appears to be done not in context with nature and the natural world, but in isolation.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad you talked a little bit about how so much of that knowledge is conveyed in ways that I suppose Western culture wouldn't expect through stories, coming down to, through generations, as opposed to, because we've been in my environmental lit class, and they're here today. One of the things we talked about was some of the books we're reading really are written by scientists, and so they have all the facts and the notes at the end. And we talked about the knowledge that comes through your book of nonfiction, Radiant Lives of Animals, that is really coming from a place, really from an oral tradition, and how that's a very different way of gaining knowledge. And I think it's not one that's necessarily familiar to Western culture. As a follow-up question.
Another thing,
Yeah,
can I interrupt a minute?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not always oral culture, because there was a lot of writing, and it's considered not writing, and yet the Bibles were all using the early writing. And especially in the North, they looked like symbols to them, but they weren't. So we don't come from just an oral tradition. We come from a listening tradition, but there is also a written tradition. And there is a book of photographs, and I write about that in the introduction to that book. It's from University of New Mexico Press, and I don't know whatever happened to it. If it came out and just flopped, or the photographer never has talked to me very much about it. So I think he's not really enthused, but they're beautiful photographs, and the introduction talks about the long history of writing.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Linda. As a follow-up to all this, in your work across all genres, you incorporate Indigenous politics, environmental politics, and feminist politics. And so I've read a good deal of your work, but for some of our audience who may not have read as much as I have, can you talk a little bit about how you negotiate those kinds of themes into a successful poem or essay, or story, any of those, and maybe some examples of ways in which you've worked to really, put into your writing some of these, some of this kind of politics successfully?
Well, for example, in the names of creeks, I end up with Sand Creek. But what I'm doing now is looking at the policies and the acts that took place over a period of my grandparents' lives to when they passed away, to our lives in the present, and how every few years, or sometimes more than once a year, there was a new act. There was something new that affected tribal peoples. So in the 1950s, it was relocation. There was something going on. There was the Dawes Act, where we lost most of our land. It just was a continuous political ripoff in a way. And then when actually what they finally decided was it cost more to kill a Native person than it did to try to assimilate one and Americanize one. And so that was the goal, to try to assimilate and Americanize all of the Native people in every way possible.
Thank you. On that note, I also in the Radiant Lives of Animals, you talk about the history of the Chickasaw Nation, and you talk a little bit about other Native tribes. Can you speak a little bit to how those tribes who were removed or dislocated from their original lands, how that differs from some other tribes that were not as greatly dislocated, or that may have been able to stay in more or less their own lands for a longer time? Because I think you talk about that a bit in Liberating Lives of Animals, that there's a difference. And I wondered how that difference affects, let's say, the Chickasaw Nation or another nation that's undergone that kind of removal, how that affects them psychologically, culturally, that sort of thing.
Well, with removal, first of all, people are in a different environment completely than from what they're accustomed, have lost everything. And what they didn't lose, they lost along the way, either through thieves or being forced to leave it behind by soldiers who accompanied them, so to speak, with guns aimed at them. And the people that primarily passed away were the elders and the keepers of tradition and the children. So without the keepers of tradition, that was like a very large loss. But even with the keepers of tradition, it would have been very difficult in a new environment to, say, find the right plant for healing or for food or for anything, and to go from being caretakers of a forest, for instance, or having an agricultural life with rich soil, to being in a place that's rock and nothing will grow. So everybody there were so many tribes that went through removal, and some fought it. Black Hawk and had a band that fought it, and they actually eroded the land between Oklahoma and their home along the Missouri River. And so it's now I-70 and it goes through Goodland, Kansas. But, they went back and forth trying to stay away from the government.
Thank you. I think it really speaks to the dislocation. It's something that also leads to a kind of fragmentation of culture, which is one of the things I think you talk a good deal about in your book.
It was totally unnecessary. The thing that was necessary, it's like it was also a land theft. It was, the ability for settlers to create homes in what had been the homes of other people. But the thing is that people could have learned how to get along together. They could have lived in the same place. It wasn't a necessary thing to do.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. I'm not on mute. I have a question. I have a few more questions of my own, but I've also gotten a question from one of our students who's in the audience. So I'd like to ask you that. Maybe it's a little bit more of a practical question. So Lauren DiTullio asks, do you connect with animals throughout your everyday life? And then the second part of the question is, how can we as a society learn to appreciate animals more?
Well, yes, I do, because they're all around me. I hear the deer talking to the little deer, to their babies outside my window. I had one that was a big buck that was traveling with a family and two young ones, one of which just kept whining until the father got so tired of it that he just went back and kind of pushed it forward. But it just couldn't keep up with his dad, I guess. But yes, I live around all kinds of wildlife and foxes and the inner house life. And so you get to know them and they get to know you. I've had young fox walk up right to me, look in my face, and their eyes are amazingly like fire. They're so beautiful. And then they look I have no idea what they're trying to say or do, but then they go on off on their way. But I get to know which ones they are. I get to recognize them. And I think that's in the book too, that the foxes are in the book, that one mother had little ones really close up the road here. And they were underneath the main road and built their den. And I didn't know if the mother was all alone, but then the father came and I was leaving little things of food like eggs. And we're allowed only to feed foxes here, no other wildlife. But then I saw the father bringing squirrels and all kinds of other things, and it started to smell like dead meat. So, so I knew that they were all taken care of. But there were 4, and they were just precious. They would be sitting out on the road when I'd come home, and just beautiful lives. And I think that you connect with them by recognizing that they are a life unto themselves, that they are equal to other lives, that we're all the same air, we're all the same breath, we're all the same life.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. I think that that comment that you just made about all living things being alive and breathing the same air is really important. And it seems like it's very hard for certain people in society to understand that fully. And I don't know why that's the case. And I'm not assuming that you would know why either. But I think that's one of the difficulties. And I think that's one of the difficulties you really speak about in your recent book of essays. And it also comes through in the poems as well, I think, that there's some sort of change in perspective that needs to occur. And it seems to me it's a really hard thing to finesse. It seems like it's taken a long time coming. So I don't know if you have any comments on that or any other observations about why it seems to be such a hard thing for much of humanity. Not all, maybe it's certain cultures, but why it seems like such a hard thing for certain individuals, let's say, to sort of have that shift in perspective so that you actually think of an animal or an insect or any other living thing or a plant as something that has a kind of, being of its own. Right. I mean, I think it's kind of interesting because I sometimes would say, oh, well, what do you think the plant thinks? And, someone says, what do you mean what the plant thinks? The plant's just a plant. I don't know if there's some way of getting past that and how that perspective can be altered. And I don't know if you have any additional insight into that or have anything else you want to add. Yeah.
One thing is we don't really know how to think and we don't know how to think beyond what we think. And we need to expand our system of what we've learned, what we've understood from our lives growing up. We need to keep expanding our thinking and ability to see the world, to see one another, and to care. And it's the hardest thing in the world to change your own thinking, your own thought system, and to open it out. But we do not think large enough. We think very small. And this is not just cultural. There are people in all cultures that are working for animals and doing amazing things. And so I can't say it's cultural anymore. At one point, maybe I would have thought that, but it's not true. To realize, for instance, how much an elephant knows, how intelligent an elephant is, how they can hear each other through the ground and through 100 miles away, and how they grieve and how their hearts are. They have big hearts. There's an essay that's not in the book because the other half of the book is about animals that are not in this area, not in this corridor. And so there's an essay in there about elephants and how one woman who saved all the baby elephants that had been orphaned by people poaching, and took care of them, how she was called Dame Daphne, and the queen sort of knighted her, or whatever you do with women, and which is why she was known as Dame. But when she retired, elephants somehow knew about it from distances, and they all came to say goodbye. And so there was this really well-behaved line of elephants waiting to go see her and to go say their final goodbye to her.
Yeah, one of the things I'm sort of taking away from what you're talking about, and also from your book, is the sense that one has to spend time. Also, that there's a sense of, like, when you talk about the animals that you have, that you interact with every day, it also takes a commitment to be around animals, non-human animals, if you will, non-human beings, and to spend time, and in that way, sort of, in other words, you seem to be speaking to a relationship, and to know when to be, how much to enter into that relationship, and then how much you really need to let these other creatures live their own lives. So I think it's kind of interesting to think about how to spend time, or how to find the time to spend, so that we have a better appreciation of the non-human world. That leads me a little bit to the next question. It's not quite in the same mode, but in The Radiant Lives of Animals, you speak of the sacredness and spirit of the living world and the cosmos. And you direct us as readers to realize our part in this sort of holy or divine and essential relationship. So I think the question is, you talk about sacredness and spirit a good deal in that book in relation to the non-human world, and I also in relation to the human world as well. But I wonder if you find that those are difficult concepts to convey in what is now largely secular mainstream America. Do you find this difficult? I mean, maybe you can speak a little bit to this sacredness that you and the spirit, and then maybe speak a little bit to, is that something that you find hard to get other people to understand, to get secular mainstream America to understand?
I think it's easier for secular than it is for people who have strong belief systems. Because if you have a belief system, you already have a set of ideas that are like a fence post and cement, unchangeable almost. And so a belief system is the problem. The belief system is you can believe anything and think it's true. For instance, look at the conspiracy theories that we've been having in the last, say, half a year, and how many people will just follow because there's a need to believe in something and they don't know what to believe in. So they just grab the first thing that they can. And so understanding that God is not, or the soul is not in one place, it's not one thing, but that it carries over into the whole world and further, farther into the universe, that we're all one big connection, one giant organism. Is like, when people are talking about the earth being a living creature, and more scientists are talking about that, then we know that we're looking at something that's so large, we can't just believe in it. We have to learn it.
Yeah, thank you. I think that I like the idea of something that's sort of so large and living, and I think that maybe is a good way to convey this idea of sacredness, because I think one of the things that I was getting at is that somehow that kind of language, words like holy and sacred don't seem to always play maybe a large enough part in contemporary culture. So that I think it's interesting to think about how it's easier for someone who's secular to learn it. But I also wonder if there are ways of getting that kind of language more easily into our everyday language. And I don't know if you have an answer to that, but I feel as though, you know, sometimes when you say sacred, you're sort of in this territory that nobody's thinking about very much. And I wonder how one can.
Well, also it's an uncomfortable territory because we don't really know what it means.
Mm-hmm.
It's like talking about love. You really can't measure love. It just happens to be something that exists, and you know it exists. And the sacred also, you can't measure it, you can't see it. So it's just something that's there. And, you know, people who study animals, work with animals, study plants. You look at Robin Kimmerer's work, or anybody's who's writing about anything in the world, and find that they eventually come to this relationship with it where they are in awe of it. And we need that constant sense of awe. And especially for people who want to write, they need awe, because you don't want to write about the mundane. You don't want to think about the mundane, although some of us just live flat lives and you know, are accustomed to that. But it's not the best life. It's not the best way to maintain yourself throughout the time you're born until the time you let go of your last breath.
Thank you. I have another a follow-up question to that from someone in the audience, and then after that I think I want to turn a little bit to the structure of your book and for our creative writers in the audience a little bit about poetry and fiction and nonfiction. But before that,
does anybody want to ask about writing?
That's what I'm going to do. Yeah, I have one more question. Yeah, Bucky Fuchs, they ask, how do you combine spiritual, like native or emotional knowledge, with the scientific Western, as in if they appear contrary on a specific subject, do you have a way to make them compatible? And I'm not sure I'm getting the whole thing. Let me start with that. And I'll start with that and then I'll go from there. Oh, I'm sorry, I can finish it. So if they appear contrary on a specific subject, do you have a way to make them compatible, or do you choose which explanation makes more sense to you?
No, I choose the one that's more fact-based and more real. But I think that in many ways, they are already compatible. It's just that we have to have a greater understanding of the world. And for example, I just did an essay for the John Muir College on how completely destructive John Muir was to the forests and the national parks that he so loved, and how many Native people died and were sent to reservations as a result of John Muir's work and his 22 years as president of the Sierra Club. And the first thing that he did that was wrong was he did not like Indian people. He called them dirty Indians, filthy, ugly, worthless. But the thing is that it was the Native people that kept the forest healthy. They knew the forest. They had always lived there. So after they were sent to reservations to keep this forest the way he thought a wild space should be in California, after that, the forests began to decline, and nobody knew what to do about the decline. And so therefore we ended up with the forest fires in the last years, which would not have happened. Other declines began earlier than just the forest fires. So there was a loss of plants, a lack of understanding about how to take care of plants, which ones to let go, which ones to let grow, how the underground system of plants work, that the elders pass the nutrients to the young ones, and so you don't cut the old growth. And there are so many things to learn in the world, that we just have to keep working at it. We have to keep studying, reading, doing research, and not just reading the science news and scientific books, but reading what Native people have said. And so if we skip the Native knowledge, then you're only getting half of the picture.
Great. Thank you, Linda. So I am going to turn it over to a writing question for our writers in the audience. And I have one of my own, and then I have another one from a student. My question is, a few of the poems in your new collection revisit events in your new book of nonfiction. So for example, you recall in The Radiant Lives of Animals, the death of a deer by wolves and how you follow the blood spots on the snow until you find its remains. And then you recount that experience again in your poem, The Kill, in your most recent book of poems. Can you speak to the difference of writing about a subject in prose versus poetry? Is there anything one or the other genres helps to accomplish that might make it a more suitable vessel for what you seek to convey?
Well, because the process of the genres are so completely different. It's so completely different that you can write about the same thing, but it's very different writing, and it's a very different outcome. It's a very different process all the way through. And so the essay form, for instance, will have a lot of other information in it, where the poem may focus on just one thing, and where that particular event or image or beauty leads you, where it takes you, hopefully to a new place, hopefully on to a different topic. For instance, you're working on a poem and you don't want it to be just about that poem. You want it to leap, as they used to call it, into something greater, stronger. So that when you get to the end, it's a different end than it was beginning. And with writing nonfiction, you are focusing on one thing all the way through pretty much. And that was the presence of, I think that was the presence of either the mountain lion or the wolves. That was the mountain lion kill. And was it?
No, I think it was the wolf kill, but it's also really interesting because towards the end, it leads to the bear coming much later and going back to the bones left by
the
wolves.
That's in the poem.
Yeah.
That's poetry. Yeah. Later, I'm awakened at night when it's warm enough to have the windows open. I don't know if you can see the snow coming down, but this is not the time of year to open your windows. But, I was awakened one night by these sounds. And so I finally realized that the bear had gone over and they were at least one was chewing on the bones and that were left because I didn't bury it. I left it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And before we go on to the student question, also, what kind of vessel is fiction for you? In other words, how is that even different from nonfiction and poetry? Do you find that you turn to fiction for particular kinds of things you want to convey?
Right. It's a story.
Mm.
And I don't even know what a story is. If somebody asked me what a story is, I don't know what I'd say. I couldn't possibly ever write a short story, I'm pretty sure. And so they just keep growing. But it has character growth, it has plots, it has different things that take place that wouldn't happen in the poem or the essay.
Great, thanks. The question I have from Lauren DiTullio again is, she's interested in the formatting of the Radiant Lives of Animals. And she was curious as to how you decided to set it up between poems and longer sections. I think what she's asking a bit here is, obviously this book has poems interspersed with the prose. And she has a question about sort of how you went through the process of putting it together in the way you put it together.
I actually didn't want to put the poems in there. I just wanted the essays. And it was the editor that wanted the poems. So I just looked at the poetry I was working on and found that there were similarities, and I broke them up so they were not the same poem and used fragments. But the editor wanted to put them in.
That's interesting. That's interesting because my environmental lit class had a science writer come in a couple of weeks ago just to speak to the class. And he was talking about wanting, in between his science work, wanting to get in more personal narrative. And he talked about how his editor told him to take all that personal stuff out, or most of it. So I think it's really interesting just for students of creative writing to hear that sometimes the sort of way in which a book ends up being structured is not always entirely in the hands of the writer. I wonder if you come across that sort of thing in any other context with any of your other books? Where
No, I never have. That's a first.
Yeah.
And as I said, the book originally was longer, and so it had a place where it ended differently, and I liked that ending a lot. So I'm going to try to put that all together in a new book and figure out how I can write an introduction to it so that it's completely focused differently on, it's animals, but it's not these animals that I live with. It's animals I have known
Okay.
in my life for
Yeah.
shorter periods of time.
Right.
And so I've never had that happen before. I've had people tell me something's not working and then give me the chance to revise it without them telling me that. But I think one of the things that happen with science writers, and particularly with male science writers, is that it doesn't become about what they're writing. It becomes about them writing about it. And
Right.
so they're always in it. And I think finally people are getting tired of that.
Yeah, it could very well be. I mean, it was kind of interesting because this individual didn't really share, I don't know what else was in the book that needed to be taken out. The other thing I wanted to mention, because this came about too, and not just with the science writer, but with other writers that I've spoken with, you said that the editor wanted you to sort of localize it, if you will, right? So localize it to animals that where you live in the space on this acreage, primarily anyway. And
well, they had a certain idea about the book being a gift book coming out just before Christmas.
Okay.
And all kinds of things, but then they didn't really publicize it except for in the Boston area. And so it didn't get out to the place where, where people would have been interested.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting. Well, it's interesting to hear that they were seeing it as a gift book, which I think also, again, for our writers in the audience is interesting to hear, because you begin to understand that, what we all want to do is just write our work and be good writers, but that there are all these other pressures that come to bear when you're trying to get your work published. Just out of curiosity, so once your editor said, well, put these poems into the book, were you happy with the result then? I mean, do you feel as though, you feel good about this?
Yeah, I feel fine about it.
Yeah.
I feel fine.
Yeah.
I think it works out really well.
Yeah.
It's just that the book of poetry came out the same year, and some of the excerpts are in that book.
Yeah.
So, I didn't want to look like I was writing the same thing twice.
Right. Of course. Yeah. Yeah. I also think it speaks to the situation of also length, in some ways that if you are writing and publishing, length seems to come into play also nowadays, maybe in ways it didn't as much in the past, but that can kind of constrain on how long the book is going to be. So,
Well, and also people who read essays may not read poetry.
yeah.
And people who read poetry may not read anything else. So you don't really know what, who is going to be attracted to what.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not very many people really go out searching for poetry unless they're like us.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely. I just want to get a sense, Julia, can you give me a sense of time? Where are we at?
Let's see. Well, I don't know. How are you doing, Linda? Could you take another question or two, or?
I could take another question.
All right. Well, Christine, you hold the questions, and after that, Christine, if you could remind people about tonight's event, in case just remind them that there's a part 2.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Let me just check my messages quickly. Again, I'm sort of doing the double.
I'm going to send you something, Christine.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
fine. I have more questions of my own, but I'd love to have questions from the audience. And I'm doing this sort of multitasking on techie stuff, so I just want to make sure I'm not overlooking somebody who might have something else they want to ask, or if I've missed a question. Here we go. John Newton, a student, asks, you mentioned communication between plants. Do they have language? How does this communication work, and what can we learn from them? Great question.
I think more often that they communicate with pheromones and hormones and chemicals. But I don't think they actually talk. But that would be interesting. I wonder what they would say about us. But read Robin Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and that would help. Another really good book on plants is called The Global Forest. And it's a very short book written by an older woman who tells how plants communicate underground. But they're very good at sending messages underneath the ground through the micro, what can I call it? What is it called? They have micro filaments and mycorrhizae and all these other things that move underground and connect with each other. They're all connected. So a lot of times if you kill one tree, its partner tree will also die. But what they do is, for instance, the eastern cedar can hold water. And then when a hardwood needs water, they can either disperse it through the underground or they can spray it. So it's an aerosol. But they know each other and what the needs are of each other.
Great, thank you, Linda. I think also one of the things going on, and hopefully I'm not misspeaking for John, also just the idea of expanding the sort of conception or understanding of language, right? So maybe it's the language of pheromones, but you're saying it's not like talking. But that animals, the idea that if you're going to see animals and plants in the living world as equal, then we're assuming that there's some way in which they communicate, right? In some way, shape, or form. So I think it's interesting to think about that sense of, we think, oh, language, that's the human thing, right? Words as we know them is the human language, but that there are other languages at work on the planet. And I think, I'm sure John's question is coming out of that idea. And I think
right. How do they communicate with each other?
Yeah.
And it's such a complex world underneath that. The novel, what is the novel that won the Pulitzer last year? The Understory. The Understory.
It's Overstory because it's about the overstory of the trees.
And is it? Okay.
Yeah, beautiful book.
But it's a great book, but he also has the understory in it too, because he talks about what's going on with the root systems. Mm-hmm. And so they're there are all kinds of things that happen in the tree world that we are not aware of. I mean, it's like an amazing and complicated thing. And I buy micro rhizi. So when I'm planting, I can put it in the ground. So I don't just, because I'm afraid that I'll disturb it, that I will disturb what's going on down there and wreck the earth in the place where I'm working. And another thing, like originally we never had earthworms here and on this continent, and they came in the trees that were brought over by the Europeans who wanted European trees planted in their yards or outside their homes. And they've been very destructive to old growth forests too. If they get in the forest, they will kill them.
Yeah, I think one of the things you're really speaking to is just the intricacy of these systems that we don't really have enough knowledge of yet, or we're just beginning to gain that knowledge. So yeah, thanks, Linda. I'm going to ask you one more question. I think if we have time for, I'm going to ask you one more question, which is because I'm sure some writers are wondering about this. Because I think it's different for every writer, but I'm going to ask you, what is your writing process or your writing schedule like? I mean, we know it's not the same for everyone, but I think students often like to hear from writers they admire. So how do you get your work done? What's your day like? Do you write every day? Do you write once a week? Any of that sort of stuff, if you'd be willing to share that with us.
No, I like to write every day if I can. It doesn't happen that way in life, but other things other things do happen that you have to take care of. But I like to get up in the morning and make some coffee and start writing. And then see where it goes. And sometimes I will still want to keep working on something later in the day, or I have to do the laundry or clean the house or something like that. And then I come back to it.
Thanks. And could you also speak very briefly to revision, that process?
I revised like crazy. If anybody saw my first drafts, I'd be so ashamed and embarrassed. But yes, I've had people submit work to me or show me work that has never been revised, and it's so clear right from the beginning. But they think that it's brilliant because we think that when we're first working. And then when we come back to it, a few days later, we realize that we need to work on it more. And so I sometimes will do, every once in a while, something comes out almost whole. But usually I do numerous revisions. And the problem I have is trying to write a novel with the computer, because I have to print it out, revise it by hand, and then put all that back in, and then something else in the story will change, and then I have to start that all over again. So doing a novel with a computer is so much harder than back in the old days. Doing it with a word processor where it was just there. You just pull the page out, take the sides off, and there it is. So this is the computers are much harder to work with. It's always good to start with by hand.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm also glad you mentioned the fact that I think it would certainly happen with a novel, but it also happens with fiction and nonfiction. And if anyone's writing short stories, that if you change one thing, then it affects everything else. And so then you have to oftentimes change other stuff. So it's a complicated process, but a worthwhile one for sure.
It is. It's a little bit of work, but it's so worth it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the results, the things that happen are just like I said earlier, when I first discovered poetry, it was like I fell in love. But it's magic. What happens is just magic. And so when you keep working on it, more magic happens. So you end up with something that's quite incredible if you're lucky.
Yep. Well, you've ended up with a lot of incredible stuff, and and we all get to enjoy it and read
Some
it.
of it hasn't been so incredible, and it's sitting around.
Yeah, well, maybe a little more revision, but certainly the stuff that's out there is wonderful. So
Thank you.
I have a feeling, I think we're out of time, Julia, is that right? So I just want to thank all of you for coming to the Q&A, and thank you, Linda, so much for
Thank you too. Thank everybody.
and answering our questions. And I also remind all of you now, the reading tonight is at the same Zoom link as this one. It's going to start at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So Linda's going to come back and see us at 5 o'clock her time. And so I just want to make sure you all attend that event. So you'll be able to hear Linda actually read from her work, not just talk about it. And also to remind you that her books are available and the links are in the chat. And you can correct me, Julie, if I'm wrong, but I think the links and the information are all in the chat so that you can buy her books through those links. And again, I just want to thank everyone. I don't know, do I need to turn it back over to you, Julie, about anything, or?
I didn't think, I have nothing more to say than that they should come tonight, but I also want to say that just remind people, I think it says so in the chat, that if you wanted a book personalized or just signed by Linda, that's a possibility too. You fill out, there's an information field that you fill out, and then Linda, we're going to send you the book plates with the names to put on them and with a thing to send it back. So
I haven't been able to get out of here, so I was hoping that it wasn't down at the post office now.
oh, no, later, because Porter Square will make a nice spreadsheet, and then we'll send that to you, and then and it won't be for weeks, and hopefully you'll be able to get out by then. If not,
right, I'll be out by then.
And I don't know if you can, it's a multitasking thing. I just want to tell you, Linda, I don't know if you can see the chat, but everybody is saying how wonderful this was and how grateful they are to you for, doing this Q&A. I mean, one after another saying, thank you, wonderful. So I just wanted you to be aware of that before we.
Thank you. Well, thank everybody.
Great.
Have
Thanks
a good
so much.
evening.